Yeah, there is no peace in the Iliad, just death
and loss and grief.
and talking horses.
Do you feel out of the loop, Phoebe?
I mean, you could watch the episodes and be all caught up.
Here's the thing about the talking horses.
Or there was that really accurate movie that was made, right? Like Troy.
Yeah,
I heard you guys talking about it, right?
Here's the thing, Phoebe. There are no talking horses in the Iliad, except for in one chapter, they just decide, okay, these two horses are going to talk, and they're going to talk mad smack to Achilles, and then they're going to stop talking forever.
They say like 2 lines. It's amazing. But today we move on to a story with no violence at all.
Wow.
Talking horses?
Clear and sunny sky.
This is The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. Has anyone not read this story before? Cool.
I mean, I haven't read it in a long time, and I've probably only read it like once or maybe twice.
I think that's the boat that most of us are in.
I read it definitely in middle school, and I was wondering as I was reading it what the experience would have been like if I hadn't known about the ending.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't go back in time and unread the story.
Yeah, I feel like partially the twist is like, I mean, it's obviously like the thing about the story, but I think knowing it kind of makes it better in the beginning, which we'll see when we read into it. But
I don't remember the twist.
Oh.
Huh.
I'm like not sure if I know what happens.
Oh. Okay.
Cool.
Well, we'll just read, and then you two can tell us your experience, and we can talk about our experience and compare. Okay, so for this one, there's lots of speaking roles, and none of them are very, like, deep characters. It's like a crowd kind of talking to each other, so I'll just start reading, and then when we come across dialogue, you can take those characters, and if they show up again, you can keep them. So the morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely, and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took less than 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather together quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced this name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking among themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers and sisters. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together, away from the pile of stones in the corner, and their jokes were quiet, and they smiled rather than laughed. The women, wearing faded house dresses and sweaters, came shortly after their menfolk. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women, standing by their husbands, began to call their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teen club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called.
Little late today, folks.
The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers set the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool, and when Mr. Summers said,
"Some of you fellows want to give me a hand?"
there was a hesitation before 2 men, Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, came forward to hold the box steady on the stool, while Mr. Summers stirred up the papers inside it. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. Mr. Summers spoke frequently to the villagers about making a new box, but no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. There was a story that the present box had been made with some pieces of the box that had preceded it, the one that had been constructed when the first people settled down to make a village here. Every year after the lottery, Mr. Summers began talking again about a new box, but every year the subject was allowed to fade off without anything being done. The black box grew shabbier each year. By now, it was no longer completely black, but splintered badly along one side to show the original wood color, and in some places faded or stained. Mr. Martin and his oldest son, Baxter, held the black box securely on the stool until Mr. Summers had stirred the papers thoroughly with his hand. Because so much of the ritual had been forgotten or discarded, Mr. Summers had been successful in having slips of paper substituted for the chips of wood that had been used for generations. Chips of wood, Mr. Summers had argued, had been all very well when the village was tiny, but now that the population was more than 300 and likely to keep on growing, it was necessary to use something that would fit more easily into the black box. The night before the lottery, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them in the box, and it was then taken to the safe of Mr. Summers' coal company and locked up until Mr. Summers was ready to take it to the square the next morning. The rest of the year, the box was put away, sometimes one place, some another. It had spent 1 year in Mr. Graves's barn, and another year underfoot in the post office, and sometimes it was set on a shelf in the Martin grocery and left there. There was a great deal of fussing to be done before Mr. Summers declared the lottery open. There were the lists to make up, the heads of families, heads of households in each family, members of each household in each family. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered there had been a recital of some sort performed by the official of the lottery, a perfunctory, tuneless chant. It had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believed the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it. Others believed he was supposed to walk among the people, but years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. There had been also a ritual salute, which the official of the lottery had had to use in addressing each person who came up to draw from the box, but this also changed with time, until now it was felt necessary only for the official to speak to each person approaching. Mr. Summers was very good at all this. In his clean white shirt and blue jeans, with one hand resting carelessly on the black box, he seemed very proper and important as he talked interminably to Mr. Graves and the Martins. Just as Mr. Summers finally left off talking and turned to the assembled villagers, Mrs. Hutchinson came hurriedly along the path to the square, her sweater thrown over her shoulders, and slid into place in the back of the crowd.
Clean forgot what day it was.
She said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her, and they both laughed softly.
Thought my old man was out back stacking wood.
Do you want to be in this frame then?
Do you want us to be in this? Okay.
Well, yeah.
Okay, come here.
Okay. The phone will recharge at some point.
It's going to be a really funny break in the video.
Yeah. Very strange. 3 cameras consolidate.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So Clean forgot what day it was. She said to Mrs. Delacroix, who stood next to her, and they both laughed softly. Sorry, you already said that. Thought my old man was out back stacking wood. Mrs. Hutchinson went on.
And then I looked out the window, and the kid was gone. And then I remembered it was the 27th and came a-running.
She dried her hands on her apron, and Mrs. Delacroix said,
"You're in time, though. They're still taking away up there."
Talking away. Up there. Rip.
Mrs. Hutchinson craned her neck to see through the crowd and found her husband and children standing near the front. She tapped Mrs. Delacroix on the arm as a farewell, and began to make her way through the crowd. The people separated good-humoredly to let her through. 2 or 3 people said, in voices just loud enough to be heard across the crowd.
Here comes your Mrs. Hutchinson.
And
Still, she made it after all.
Mrs. Hutchinson reached her husband, and Mr. Summers, who had been waiting, said cheerfully,
Thought we were going to have to get on without you, Tessie.
Mrs. Hutchinson said, grinning,
Wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink now, would you, Joe?
my dishes?
My dishes.
Oh, no.
And soft laughter ran through the crowd as the people stirred back into position after Mrs. Hutchinson's arrival.
Well, now.
Mr. Summers said soberly.
Guess we better get started. Get this over with so as we can go back to work. Anybody ain't here?
Dunbar.
Several people said.
Dunbar.
Mr. Summers consulted his list.
Come on, Dunbar.
He said,
That's right. He broke his leg, hasn't he? Who's drawing for him?
Me, I guess.
a woman said, and Mr. Summers turns to look at her.
Wife draws for her husband.
Mr. Summers said,
Don't you have a grown boy to do it for you, Janie?
Although Mr. Summers and everyone else in the village knew the answer perfectly well, it was the business of the official of the lottery to ask such questions formally. Mr. Summers waited with an expression of polite interest while Mrs. Dunbar answered.
Horace, but he's not 16 yet.
Mrs. Dunbar said regretfully.
Guess I gotta fill in for the old man this year.
Right.
Mr. Summers said. He made a note on the list he was holding. Then he asked,
Watson boy drawing this year?
A tall boy in the crowd raised his hand.
Here,
He said.
I'm drawing for my mother and me.
He blinked his eyes nervously and ducked his head as several voices in the crowd said things like,
Good fellow, lad.
and
Glad to see your mother's got a man to do it.
Well,
Mr. Summers said.
guess that's everyone. Old man Warner make it?
A voice said, and Mr. Summers nodded. A sudden hush fell on the crowd as Mr. Summers cleared his throat and looked at the list.
All ready?
He called.
Now I'll read the names, heads of families first, and the men come up and take a paper out of the box. Keep the paper folded in your hand without looking at it until everyone has had a turn. Everything clear?
The people had done it so many times they only half listened to the directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said,
Adams?
A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward.
Hi, Steve.
Mr. Summers said, and Mr. Adams said.
Hi, Joe.
They grinned at each other humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand.
Allen?
Mr. Summers said.
Anderson? Bentham?
Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore.
Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row.
Seems like we got through with the last one only last week.
Time sure goes fast.
Mrs. Graves said.
Clark? Delacroix?
There goes my old man.
Mrs. Delacroix said. She held her breath while her husband went forward.
Dunbar?
Mr. Summers said, and Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said,
Go on, Janie.
and another said.
Here she goes. Where next?
Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around from the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and selected a slip of paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd, there were men holding the small folded papers in their large hand, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper.
Harbert? Hutchinson?
Get up there, Bill.
Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed.
Jones?
They do say
Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him.
that over in the North Village, they're talking of giving up the lottery.
Old Man Warner snorted.
Bag of crazy fools.
He said,
Listening to the young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves. Nobody work anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chicken and acorns. There's always been a lottery.
He added petulantly.
Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody.
Some places have already quit lotteries.
Mrs. Adams said.
Nothing but trouble in that.
Old Man Warner said stoutly.
Pack of young fools.
Martin,
And Bobby Martin watched his father go forward.
Overdyke, Percy,
I wish they'd hurry.
Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son.
I wish they'd hurry.
They're almost through.
Her son said.
You get ready to run tell Dad.
Mrs. Dunbar said. Mr. Summers called his own name and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called,
Warner,
77th year I've been in the lottery.
Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd.
77th time.
Watson,
A tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said,
Don't be nervous, Jack.
and Mr. Summers said.
take your time, son. Zanini,
After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said,
all right, fellows.
For a moment, no one moved, and then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying,
Who is it?
Who's got it?
Who's got it?
It's the Watsons.
Then the voices began to say,
It's Hutchinson.
Bill Hutchinson's got it.
Go tell your father.
Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill Hutchinson was standing quietly, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers,
You didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair.
You good sport, Tessie.
Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said,
All of us took the same chance.
Shut up, Tessie.
Bill Hutchinson said.
Well, everyone,
Mr. Summers said.
that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little more to get done in time.
He consulted his next list.
Bill,
He said,
you draw for the Hutchinson family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons?
There's Dawn and Eva.
Mrs. Hutchinson yelled.
Make them take their chance.
Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie.
Mr. Summers said gently.
You know that as well as anyone else.
It wasn't fair.
Tessie said.
I guess not, Joe.
Bill Hutchinson said regretfully.
My daughters draw with their husband's family. That's only fair. And I've got no other family except the kids.
Then as far as for drawing for families is concerned, it's you.
Mr. Summers said in explanation.
And as far as drawing for households is concerned, that's you too, right?
Right.
Bill Hutchinson said.
How many kids, Bill?
Mr. Summers asked formally.
3.
Bill Hutchinson said.
There's Bill Jr. and Nancy and little Dave and Tessie and me.
All right, then.
Mr. Summers said.
Harry, you got their tickets back?
Mr. Graves nodded and held up the little slips of paper.
Put them in the box, then.
Mr. Summers directed.
Take Bill's and put it in.
I think we ought to start over.
Mrs. Hutchinson said, as quietly as she could.
I tell you, it wasn't fair. You didn't give him time enough to choose. Everybody saw it.
Mr. Graves had selected the 5 slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground, where the breeze caught them and lifted them off.
Listen, everybody.
Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her.
Ready, Bill?
Mr. Summers asked, and Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded.
Remember,
Mr. Summers said.
take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave.
Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box.
Take a paper out of the box, Davy.
Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed.
Take just one paper.
Mr. Summers said.
Harry, you hold it for him.
Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist and held it while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly.
Nancy next.
Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box.
Bill Jr.
Mr. Summers said, and Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, near knocked the box over as he got a paper out.
Tessie.
Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a moment, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper and held it behind her.
Bill.
Mr. Summers said, and Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with a slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered,
I hope it's not Nancy.
and the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd.
It's not the way it used to be.
Old Man Warner said clearly.
People ain't the way they used to be.
All right.
Mr. Summers said.
Open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's.
Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time, and both beamed and laughed, turning around to the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads.
Tessie.
Mr. Summers said. There was a pause. Then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank.
It's Tessie.
Mr. Summers said, and his
Sure.
voice was hushed.
Show us your paper, Bill.
Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it. The black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before, with the heavy pencil in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd.
All right, folks.
Mr. Summers said.
Let's finish quickly.
Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar.
Come on,
She said.
hurry up.
Mr. Dunbar had large stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath.
I can't run at all. You'll have to go ahead and I'll catch up with you.
The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchinson was already in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her.
It isn't fair.
She said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying,
Come on, everyone.
Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of the villagers, with Mrs. Graves beside him.
It isn't fair. It isn't right.
Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her.
Somber.
Somber is right.
You two who didn't know the ending.
I did remember the ending that it was stoning, but I didn't know if that was a twist or if there was like a twist that like it was going to be the main character's baby or something.
Fair.
Okay, so I actually 100% went into this thinking it was a different story.
Oh, okay.
But I have read this, and once I realized that this is the story it was, I remember.
Okay, so you actually don't have the perspective of someone who didn't know what the story was going to be.
Well, yeah, not exactly, I guess.
Well, so all of us being people who knew or remembered the ending, I think what is cool is seeing how people are acting before it happens, because they all know what's going to happen, and they're all for it. And there seems to be like maybe a folk legend reason why they are doing it, but it's just kind of something they do.
It's very like Hunger Games-esque.
Yeah, I was thinking that before we started. I was like, this does remind me of when they are choosing who the tribute is. And
Yeah.
it's like exactly the same vibe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely imagine that this took inspiration, or the Hunger Games took inspiration
Yeah.
from this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This short story ripped off Hunger Games.
In the Hunger Games, you can put more of your name in for extra food, which is interesting. I always thought that was neat because it's like punishing the lower classes and whatever. But this seems like everyone has the exact same chance of getting chosen. Not sure which is spookier, actually.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the Hunger Games, like, you're probably gonna die, but you have like one chance of winning. Whereas in this, it's the end for you.
And also, it's way creepier to me because in this story, it's obviously like it's your own community doing this,
Yeah.
and everyone has the power that they could have stopped this, and they just chose to maintain this tradition. Whereas in the Hunger Games, you're being like imposed by a central government that is forcing this to happen. So I guess it's like the difference between being like, oh, we are oppressed by a horrible government to we are oppressed by ourselves.
The one wildest moment in the whole story was when like the kids realized it wasn't them and they were like, oh good, like we're not the ones that are going to die. It's going to be our mom or our dad.
Well, I don't even know if that like would hit them that fast. That like, I don't know. I feel like the relief of like, oh, it's not me, just like outweighs at that age, like the realization that it is someone else.
But even so, like then like when that realization hits and they're like, okay, we're doing this, and like we were happy that we weren't picked, but like it's just kind of like a condensed version of all of the townspeople being happy that they're not picked.
Yeah. The moment that I remembered from reading this in high school was when someone gave Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles, even though he's like obviously like 3 years old, and it's his mother getting killed, and they were still like, you need some stones.
Also creepy when they were like, wait, our daughters count too, don't they? Can't they be killed?
Yeah.
Part that gets me was the line where it's like they don't remember the rituals or anything, but that they remember there were stones involved.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, why are you doing this? Like they don't remember. They're just like, it's that time of year again. Guess we got to kill somebody.
Yeah.
Is there a food shortage? I need more information.
I think like that reminds me of like stuff like the Christmas tree, where it's like, why do we do the Christmas tree? It's an old pagan tradition. No one knows, who started it or why. We just do it. Like nothing to do with Christmas. We just do it anyway. It reminds me of that in a way that it's just like a tradition that we do for some reason. But at least that doesn't kill anybody.
It's also eerie to see, like, I think she was talking to Mrs. Delacroix earlier on, and then as soon as she selected, Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands, and then told Mrs. Dunbar, come on, hurry up. And they're just so eager that they're running to go stone her.
Also like that Mrs. Hutchinson was like late and like could have missed it, and then her dishes in my sink. Like she didn't leave the dishes in her sink, and that's good, I guess, but like if she had not like done that, I don't know, things might have been different.
But then again, like if she left the dishes in the sink or whatever, like probably one of her kids would die, or her husband.
Maybe.
I do think that it's a cool choice where they're just like very common names. Like these names are just so normal, and it feels like the routine around this whole thing is so normal. So it really gets to that feeling of it being like, oh, it's just like a weird thing we do, but it's necessary for the survival of our community, I swear.
What do you think the message is on that?
Something about the ability to persuade a crowd.
When was it written?
1948.
There was something about the way that it was written that reminded me of like the Milgram experiments. No, the Milgram experiments were the ones where they were like, the experimenter was like, okay, you have to deliver an electric shock to this person in another room, and you would hear them like screaming. So that one was more, I was just looking up, that one was in the 60s, but that one was more about like authority telling you to do terrible things. And people were like much more willing to harm another person anonymously than they originally thought. But then there was another set where they were like, had a bunch of researchers in a room and one experiment subject, and the experiment subject came into the room and thought that everybody was a subject, and the experimenters were all like, just say something that was blatantly untrue. And the person in the room was like, yeah, that must be correct, and would just like agree with them no matter what they were saying. Reminds me a lot of the like classic psychology studies where they're like, actually, people suck.
And I think it's acceptable. Like, I feel like the correlation between the first experiment and this one like still tracks. It's just that the authority is this society, and the fact that the society is like all unanimously doing something and going along with each other is still an authority, even though it's not a specific authority.
Yeah.
And it's just like all the remarks of like, oh, like those stupid people in the town over that are giving this up, they're gonna go to hell. And like just people being like, this is like the last vestige of our society that's keeping us safe and stuff like that, just like reinforces that authority by means of repetition.
Yeah, I think that is a really important theme, like telling you to question conformity and tradition as opposed to just going along with it. And the other towns remind me of like, like when Massachusetts was the only state with gay marriage, and the other, states were probably like, wow, Massachusetts is like going to the dogs. And, it's like any progressive move can be seen as like, well, that's the end of everything by people who are still in conservative zones. So like, that's what, like this town is more conservative, it seems, than the town that's getting rid of the lottery. And they judge that immediately, like without even thinking, maybe they're right.
I did notice that they say like up north is where they've already stopped or are considering stopping lotteries.
Yeah, Shirley Jackson was American, so I think that would still stand. The story reads so American, I probably didn't even have to say that.
I mean, I think the thing that I was thinking about with the Milgram experiments is they were kind of done to be like, were the Nazis evil humans, or was this just human nature to follow orders? And given that this was written in the late 40s, like I could definitely see it being like, Nazis thought they were following their like cultural heritage too.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll do that. And this was still like when Jim Crow laws were in effect too, right? So
Yeah,
it's
that's
like,
true.
I feel like there was a lot of like neighbors smiling in your face and then like being part of your murder.
This is, I think, a little before McCarthyism. It reminded me of that right away, of like accusing anybody you wanted of being a communist and then them getting in like a heck of a lot of trouble. Not the exact same vibe, but I think just like mid 20th century conformity and fear and xenophobia.
I did read it the first time, but the moment where they're like, oh, like here we'll help the little kids pull the things out of the box. Like I didn't necessarily remember that age difference from middle school when I read it last time. But it seems crazy. Like it's not like a draft where you have to be like an adult to participate. It's like they could have murdered a child.
They probably have at some time.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is like very up.
And then there's this guy being like, 77th lottery, and I'm still fine.
I don't know if part of why they're all so ready to participate in the stoning is the fact that they've just done it. So they're like desensitized to it. But it's like, whenever they're like, the voice in the crowd is like, oh, I hope it's not Nancy. I go to school with Nancy. Like, imagine just having to like switch in an instant and be like, this person is my best friend and I go to school with her and I see her all the time and I hang out with her. But I guess I'm stoning her to death now.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder how that would affect your psyche as a person, not only knowing that you or your family could die any year, but also like anyone you know, all your friends, and that you'd have to participate in it. And that your friends would participate in killing you.
Like, I feel like that would make it hard to form close relationships.
Yeah, true. I was going to say, I feel like that like links to a lot of things where people's response to a lot of like, we were talking about progressive things and like progressive reforms. A lot of the time the response is, well, like I did this and it's like been this way forever. So why should I change this now? And I think that part of that instinct comes from the fact that you'd have to grapple with that emotionally if you were to say it was actually wrong. Because if any of if these people got together and decided that, no, this is terrible and we're going to stop doing that, they would all have to go through the like emotions of, well, like it's my 77th
Time's
lottery,
going.
so I killed 77 people,
Yeah.
and I need to recognize that that's wrong, and that's a hard thing to overcome, which leads to understanding why they are just like able to stay in denial, because the alternative is so brutal.
It's like low-key raising the minimum wage or forgiving college debt, or
Yeah.
it's like, this is how we've always done it, and thousands and millions of people have been in devastating debt before, so why shouldn't the rest of you?
They want to maintain the status quo. Like most of the people want to maintain the status quo because they're not the one getting preyed upon. And that's the safety that they experience, but also being a part of the system. Like there's one person who's not in that society who then is immediately separated and then doesn't agree with that. So it's basically like this is not protecting them from anything, actually.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
nobody voices a complaint until they're the ones
Right. Because like
Yeah.
as long as you're part of the society, as long as you're part of the group of people who is able to like control the situation, and you feel safe because you're like, I'm like one out of all these people, it's not going to be me, and we need it to grow the plants or whatever, because while I'm a part of the society, I want the society to succeed. But then as soon as that one person is like becomes the other, they immediately see that this is wrong, and it's
Right.
like it is because they're about to die, but it's also because they're immediately no longer part of the society, and they immediately don't care about the future of the society because they're not a part of it anymore, and
Yes.
they're about to be killed by the society.
Yes. Yes.
Think a lot about incarceration.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good example, because like nobody who isn't affected by prison tends to like think about it very hard at all in their everyday life, you know? But then like the second that you or someone that you know and love faces a prison sentence, you start realizing how messed up it is and how difficult it is to deal with and how inhumane it is. But it's like, it's just out of sight, out of mind until then, until you personally are affected by it. And I think that shows the danger in that, is that people get hurt without you realizing.
There's an illusion that being a part of this collective makes you safe. There actually is no freedom until everybody is equal and the whole system is abolished, even though it only touches one person at a time.
Maybe there are better systems for ensuring that everybody gets what they need other than murdering and sacrificing some people.
What?
Maybe.
You a communist?
Don't tell McCarthy.
We're like slowly becoming a communist podcast.
Slowly but surely.
Classics and commies.
Ooh.
Ooh.
Yes.
But it's also, yeah, it's like the society isn't like fully free unless everybody is, but also the like line between you and other is a lot narrower than people think.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like it also speaks to how quickly people can sometimes jump to that othering process, where it's like, oh, you like some arbitrary thing happened and therefore you're out. And it's like literally a black spot. It's like a black mark. So it's like, as soon as you get a black spot on your name, as soon as you do something disgraceful, a society is very willing to just cast you out and make you not be part of the society anymore. So I feel like that is.
Yeah, and they really shut out, I mean, like, you know, they're not going to listen to Mrs. Hutchinson.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, that same thing happens in other systems of like trying to stand up for yourself and just like absolutely getting nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
There's not even like a moment of silence for her or a prayer or anything. They're just like, all right, time to die. Like, they don't give her 2 seconds. It's kind of like,
Or even let her like hug her husband and children.
yeah. So like unceremonious, ironically. Just like, cool, let's get it over with. Get back to work.
I don't even see any of that, the inklings of that love between
Mhm.
like her husband and her children.
Yeah, like his last
her
words.
friends.
His last words to her were, "Shut up, Tessie."
Oh.
He went over to his wife and forced a slip of paper out of her hand.
Maybe that's like what we were talking about, like with relationships. You can't really have like a deep, loving relationship if you're prepared at any moment for them to be murdered by you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Like, I love you. You're the mother of my children, but I might murder you once a year.
Mhm.
Guess we'll find out.
Yeah. That is the difference, isn't it? Like, I was thinking it in terms of like you could die at any moment, but like technically anyone could die at any moment. But it's not going to happen that you'd kill them at any moment. And that's how this is different.
Mhm.
And I wonder if it's like just in general relationships, or if it's like they've already kind of started the process of trying to disconnect from each other with that knowledge.
Yeah.
Which is like so weird because they like still agree to like do it. Like they could live in like total fear of like one another, and like they don't have like any feelings about one another, but like they still have like this this rather spoken agreement that like we're still gonna do this, right? I mean, it's within everybody's power to just not do it, but they're just like okay with it anyway because it's what they know.
Yeah.
It doesn't really seem like anybody was twisting their arm to like make this happen. Like they all showed up, they all did the things with the paper and whatever. It's just crazy.
Stoning is such a communal way to murder someone.
Yeah, it's like full participation, and then because like to everyone's point, like how can you like really trust anyone if they're so to kill you because this is the tradition, but like they like still function as like a whole unit anyway. It's just weird.
I just remembered they also do like a communal stoning situation like this in Handmaid's Tale.
And the Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah. That little book.
But I guess in The Handmaid's Tale, it's more like, it definitely is a lot more enforced than it appears to be in this, and a lot more about total control of these people's actions. So yeah, this is weirder because it's like we've been saying, like more of a choice, it seems like.
It seems like the young boys at the beginning are excited about it, like collecting the stones and running around. The adults seem a little less into it. I don't know if that's because the adults have grown a conscience, or if it's just like kids like Christmas more than adults do. Like they just.
Well, I think the adults are like aware, like this could be me or anyone in my family a lot more than the children are.
I kind of got like this vibe of excitement from that one lady that like got the really big rock that was like too big and was like, come on, let's go. It like they were like above it until the moment they weren't, and then they were like just as excited as the kids.
The Handmaid's Tale bit reminded me of that because in the book anyway, she's like, there's this moment where it stopped being about being told to do something, and for a moment she was like into it and being like, yes, I do want to kill them, and it like scared her because that is inside of her and it's inside of everybody. So I do wonder if like maybe the reason why the stoning is the one part of the tradition that they still remember is because they like it in a sick way, because it is this like violent thing that they all do engage in every year.
Well, I feel like it's got to be tied to like really strong positive memories because it's connected to the feeling of relief of, oh, I'm not going to die.
Mm-hmm.
So, like that moment is like very full of like, positive feelings.
Yeah, sort of like catharsis. And if you tie that catharsis, because you're not tying the catharsis to the lottery, you're tying it to the celebration after it. So you're like, wow, that lottery sucked because I was so nervous. But then we like all participated in this act when we were so happy that we didn't die. It's like
the community building.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're Pavloving yourself to love stone people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You're like, I hate the lottery, but I love the stoning people, which is not great.
No.
Well, and also like psychologically, then you have to convince yourself that it's worth it because you like just went through all of that and it was connected to positive feelings. So like the cognitive dissonance is strong, and then you like believe that it's worth it because if you don't believe that it's worth it, then you admit to yourself that you're a multiple murderer.
Yeah, and we were talking about the othering of the person who loses the lottery or wins the lottery or however the phrase would be. So that person immediately gets othered, but everybody else gets affirmed in their place in society, at least for a year. But like at a life and death moment, you are going to feel like that's forever.
Yeah.
So immediately you're like, I was just told by my community that I am part of my community. We are like one together in this, and we're going to do a big collective action together. I feel so like related to all these people who are part of my community. And that is like, that's just another form of control. That's another way that people just like will do crazy things because they are either part of society or ostracized by society.
I had two thoughts. One was, I feel like that's a very like popular tactic in cults and cult recruitment. But also I was just wondering if the reason why they try to teach this in middle school is to try and make some sort of a point about bullying.
Could be.
You know, like you think you're part of the in crowd, but they'll turn on you too.
Yikes.
Wow.
Just priming kids to accept the reality.
I would like it to be like a question authority. Don't just listen to what they tell you kind of lesson, but you're probably right. It's probably about bullying.
I mean, I think Shirley Jackson probably meant it as a lesson about questioning authority, but
Yeah.
Miss Nickerson in 7th grade probably did not.
Tying it to bullying makes me think of Lord of the Flies. But before that, I was going to say that we're also like really making strong connections, I would say, to the insurrection and hive mindset of conspiracy theories and whatnot that sparked that.
Yeah, I feel like conspiracy theories also can be developed a lot from that sense of identity, where you're like, oh, we, like, for example, with flat Earth, people are like, they identify with the fact that they're flat earthers, and that compounds on itself so that they, like, will start to see proof for that in everything they do, and they love all these flat earthers who are their friends and family and things like that. So that theory just becomes like a part of reality for them. So I think that's a great point, because you can have these fringe movements that has this happen over the internet within another society. And like we can see clearly there are other towns in this story that don't do this. It's not a universal thing. These groups still do it.
I do think one thing that makes this unique is the fact that it could happen to anybody equally. Because like we mentioned the Hunger Games, you can, like everyone gets one ticket in, but you can, if you're poor, you have to put more tickets in to afford to eat. And I also thought this was kind of like the Purge in the fact that it's like one day a year. But in the Purge, if you're rich enough, you can have the security to not get killed and whatever. I think those are making statements on capitalism. This doesn't seem to be doing that because everybody gets one ticket and that's it. And like, I guess maybe if you have a larger family, you personally have a higher chance of surviving. But
that's an interesting point.
yeah,
I wonder, like, because they mentioned other towns that take a lot longer to do this because they have a lot more people there. So I wonder if you are like able to move, or if that's restricted. But I mean, that would lower your chances if you could get to a more populated area.
Or a town that doesn't have the lottery.
Yeah, north.
I found that interesting what you said about the fact, because like that makes sense. The fact that if you have more children, you are less likely to die of the lottery. And I think that is interesting in the sense of like, oh, if you're trying to create conformity in the form of like, you are serving your society by becoming like a family and having a lot of kids. It feels like that would play into that. And I feel like it tracks onto a lot of like society's view on to be a successful family, you like have kids, like a bunch of them, especially.
Sons.
Yeah, a lot of sons for sure. But I don't know if that actually plays into this specific story. But yes.
But also,
like
then if your family member dies in the lottery, then you're more likely to die in the lottery.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that one family where like the older son went up to draw, and it doesn't say it, but I think it implies that his father died probably a couple years ago or last year in the lottery.
Damn. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And so now he's like, even though he just lost his dad, perhaps last year, he still has to go up and draw for himself and his mother.
That's brutal.
Yeah. And he has the same exact chance of anyone else, is also losing his mom or losing himself again.
Well, like, comment, and subscribe.
Brutal ending. Oh, owie.
I tried to honestly for a second. I was like, "What would Murat say?"
You know that if Murat was here, he'd be like, comment, and subscribe if you like stoning people. If you get the black spot, then we'll stone you.
Like,
No.
which do you want?
Everybody must get stoned.
Oh.
No, just one family. Just one person from one
family must get stoned. It's a much different song.
When you phrase it like that,
It would be fun to have that be like a theme of a party if you had like a classics themed party, and then everybody who wanted to smoke weed put their name in the hat, and then someone who
And then
got the
only
black
one
spot
of them
would
got
get a
to.
giant blunt. What?
And be forced to do it alone.
Everybody who wants to smoke, but only one of them gets to.
well, at least they get greens. We'll say.
Yeah.
So we'll watch Troy and do that.
Yeah.
One person gets stoned.
The rest just suffer through Troy. Stone cold sober.
Well, if that's, if the lottery is a bad thing, I think the person with the black dot doesn't get stoned, and that's the twist. Everyone else gets to get high. The person with the black dot has to watch Troy sober.
Oh, it's the entertainment equivalent of the situation.
I hope it's Nancy.
Conform to our
This is our sponsor.